snow crunched beneath boots that had marched too far, the sound sharp as glass in the brittle November air. The women moved in a silent line, each one draped in the tattered remnants of uniforms that no longer carried authority. Their collars were frayed, their hems caked with mud, their belts hanging loose from bodies thinned by war. Faces pale with fatigue and dust, they stepped hesitantly past the barbed wire gate, expecting the growl of American guards, the bark of orders, the sting of hunger renewed. Instead, their first greeting was not the metallic click of rifles but the warm, invisible hand of a smell, rich, heavy, almost intoxicating. It rose from somewhere deep inside the camp, roasted meat, onions softening in butter, coffee so strong the very air seemed to darken with its weight. They froze. War had stripped them of many things: homes, husbands, certainty, and pride. But perhaps most of all, it had stripped them of meals like this. In the Germany they had left behind, women queued for hours to buy a single carrot. Mothers traded jewelry for bread that was half sawdust. Meat had become a memory retold to children as if it were a fairy tale. Yet here, in enemy hands, came the impossible promise of abundance. The American guard at the gate, a farm boy from Iowa whose cheeks were red with cold, waved them forward with a casualness that unsettled them. Not cruelty, not contempt, just formality. Inside, a wide wooden hall flickered with light from bare bulbs strung along rafters. Long tables stretched across the room, and upon them lay trays and platters that seemed obscene in their fullness. Golden roast turkey carved into glistening slices, mountains of mashed potatoes crowned with rivers of gravy, bowls of peas so green they looked unreal. There were baskets of rolls as white as snow, slabs of butter curling soft against the heat, pies that steamed cinnamon into the rafters. One woman, Ilse, 23, a nurse's assistant with hair that had once shone like copper before smoke dulled it, whispered sharply in German, "It must be a trick." Another, Anna, who had buried her husband near Stalingrad, stared at the pies with an expression almost fearful. Hunger had made them suspicious of generosity. In their minds, the enemy should sneer, should starve, should punish. Instead, the Americans stood by, waiting, almost bored, as if serving feasts to prisoners were an ordinary duty, no stranger than posting a guard or lighting a lamp. The women shuffled forward, each given a tin tray. Ladles clanged. Steam rose. Coffee was poured into heavy mugs. They gripped the food as if it might vanish, as if someone would soon shout that it had all been a mistake. Their fingers trembled, their eyes darted. A few murmured prayers they had long forgotten. The first bite came reluctantly, then desperately, then without shame. Bread tore, gravy dripped, meat was swallowed too fast to taste. Some wept quietly, cheeks burning hotter than the broth. The irony was crueler than any insult. For months they had been told by propaganda posters and radio voices that capture meant torture, that the Americans were monsters who would treat them worse than animals. Now, instead of chains, there was roast beef. Instead of whips, there was apple pie. Instead of silence, the steady clatter of cutlery. One prisoner later recalled that she thought she had stumbled into some bizarre theater performance staged to humiliate her. They wanted us to eat like queens so that we would remember how little Germany could give. The truth was stranger still. The United States, bound by the Geneva Convention, fed its prisoners of war with the same rations allotted to its own soldiers. And because America's farmland had not been bombed into ashes, those rations were bountiful. While Berliners boiled nettles and gnawed on ersatz bread, their captured daughters sat in wooden halls thousands of miles away, tasting butter for the first time in years. Numbers alone tell the story. German civilians in 1944 averaged fewer than 1,200 calories a day. German POWs in the United States consumed nearly 3,000. The figures were clinical, but to these women, they translated into flesh restored, strength returning, hunger quieted. At the far end of the table, a guard in khaki joked with the cook about football. The women could not understand the words, but they understood the tone, relaxed, human, utterly indifferent to their fear. That indifference, perhaps, was the most shocking thing of all. They had expected rage, accusations, reminders of the bombings their country had unleashed. Instead, they seemed to vanish into a system that regarded them as neither villains nor victims, simply mouths to be fed, bodies to be housed, names to be logged. Ilse pressed her fork into a slice of pie, marveling at its softness. She thought of her younger brother, somewhere in the ruins of Hamburg, who had not tasted sugar in years. A sudden wave of guilt swept through her, as strong as the hunger that had guided her hand to her mouth. Each bite felt like betrayal, as if the sweetness were stolen not from Americans but from her own blood back home. Anna, seated beside her, noticed her trembling. Quietly, she touched her wrist and whispered, "Eat. We must live." The hall grew louder as hunger melted into relief. Laughter even surfaced, small and nervous, but laughter nonetheless. One woman squinted suspiciously at a bowl of bright red gelatin, unsure whether it was food or medicine. When a guard leaned over and said the word, "Jello," she repeated it uncertainly, then broke into a shy grin. The absurdity of it all, learning a new language through dessert, made the table ripple with giggles. For the first time in years, the sound of war receded from their throats. And yet, beneath the warmth of the lamps and the fullness of the meal, unease lingered. They knew this was only the beginning. What lay beyond the dining hall, beyond the barbed wire, beyond this surreal hospitality? Was it kindness meant to tame them, or was it simply the efficiency of a nation that could afford to be generous? They could not know. But they understood one thing with clarity. The world they had been taught to expect had vanished the moment they tasted American bread. Outside, the cold deepened, and searchlights swept across the wire. Inside, bellies filled, hands steadied, and minds began to crack open to doubt. The first night of captivity ended not with punishment, but with pie, and that, more than any weapon, unsettled them. For if the enemy fed them like this, what other truths had been lies? The women did not yet know, but dawn would bring another shock that would test not only their stomachs, but their very sense of who they were. Back in Germany, before capture ever tightened around them, these women had been fed a different kind of diet. Propaganda, portioned daily in newspapers, radio speeches, and posters that screamed from street corners. The message was simple. Surrender meant degradation. Captivity meant torment. Americans were painted as beasts who would treat Germans as cattle, stripping away dignity with deliberate cruelty. Mothers whispered these warnings to daughters. Commanders hissed them to their units. Fear became the seasoning in every ration of thin broth and black bread. To be taken alive by the enemy was to step into a nightmare from which no one awoke. Yet as Ilsa and Anna sat in the warmth of that first dining hall, surrounded by the clatter of trays and the sweet perfume of coffee, the nightmare had inverted itself. Instead of cattle, they were guests at a banquet. Instead of being treated as subhuman, they were being served by men in uniforms no different from waiters in some distant American diner. The propaganda they had swallowed for years began to curdle in their throats. In Germany, scarcity had been weaponized. Posters showed women grimacing under the lash of faceless enemies, food stolen from their plates, children left crying in the cold. Better to die in rubble than live in their camps, the slogans urged. The irony was almost unbearable, for here in the American heartland, the rubble was absent, the children were not starving, and the women themselves were being fed more lavishly than they had been in their own homes. Each slice of turkey was a contradiction. Each spoonful of potatoes a rebuke to the lies that had marched them into this war. The Americans had their own rules to follow, rules that seemed alien to women raised under a government where rules bent to ideology. The Geneva Convention required equal treatment of prisoners, and in the United States this obligation was taken seriously. It was not mercy, nor friendship, nor sentiment. It was law, cold and bureaucratic, yet to these women it looked like charity. They were astonished to learn that the rations they received matched those allotted to U.S. soldiers. Eggs, beef, sugar, coffee, the very luxuries their families in Germany dreamt of. For German civilians in 1944, sugar was rationed to less than a spoonful a day. Here, powdered sugar dusted donuts. The first evening of disbelief ripened into the second morning of astonishment. The women awoke to the smell of bacon frying, coffee brewing, bread toasting golden. Outside, frost clung to the barbed wire like lace. Inside, butter melted into pancakes. Ilsa looked down at her tray, its contents nearly mocking her memories of Berlin, where she once stood for 6 hours to buy turnips. Anna chewed slowly, her eyes distant, remembering the night she had boiled grass to quiet her children's stomachs before they died in the air raids. She could hardly swallow without tears. The guards, often little older than the prisoners, carried themselves with a kind of relaxed efficiency. They spoke in English too quick to follow, yet their tones lacked menace. One soldier even offered a smile, awkward but genuine, when a woman fumbled her mug of coffee. It shattered on the floor, hot liquid spreading across the planks, and instead of shouting, he simply fetched another. For women who had expected torment, the absence of cruelty felt almost surreal. They had prepared themselves for blows. Instead, they were met with shrugs. Not all trusted it. Some muttered that the food was poisoned, that kindness was a mask for something darker. One prisoner spat the word verator at another who ate too eagerly, calling her a traitor to the hunger of her people. But the growl of stomachs spoke louder than accusations. By the third day, suspicion yielded to appetite. Plates were cleaned, coffee pots drained, and the propaganda they had carried in their heads began to crack like brittle glass. The statistics made the contrast even sharper. German POWs in America consumed nearly twice the calories of German civilians back home. Their camps maintained libraries, orchestras, even classes. It was not paradise. There was barbed wire, armed watchtowers, rules that cut like stone, but it was far from the hell promised by Reich Radio. To many, this realization was not comforting but deeply unsettling. If the enemy could be this humane, what did it say about the government that had lied so insistently? Ilse found herself studying the faces of the American guards. They were broad-shouldered, well-fed, their eyes unclouded by desperation. She remembered the propaganda caricatures, hulking brutes, snarling, crude. Instead she saw farm boys who hummed tunes under their breath while polishing rifles, men who laughed easily at jokes only they could understand. Humanity, not monstrosity. That, perhaps, was the most dangerous revelation of all. Around the barracks, whispers began to spread. Some women admitted they no longer feared execution. Others confessed a shame deeper than fear, shame at being treated better by their enemies than by their own leaders. Anna put it plainly one night, staring at the ceiling of the wooden hut as snow tapped against the roof. If this is our captivity, then who are the real prisoners back home? Still, unease never vanished entirely. Each kindness felt heavy with the possibility of reversal. What if it was only the beginning of some psychological war? What if tomorrow, the food vanished, replaced by hunger to break their spirit? They lived between gratitude and dread, tasting both in every bite. Yet the truth endured, undeniable as the scent of coffee at dawn. The Americans were not what they had been told. Reality had cut propaganda to ribbons. And while the women filled their stomachs, their minds churned with a more unsettling hunger, the hunger to know what else had been lies. They did not have to wait long for answers, for life inside the camp would soon reveal surprises stranger than any feast, testing not only their faith but their very understanding of what it meant to be defeated. The first shock had been the food. The second, the quiet civility of guards. But as days stretched into weeks, the women learned that captivity was not a single meal or a single kindness. It was a rhythm, a life built inside fences of barbed wire where the ordinary returned in unfamiliar shapes. Morning began with roll call, breath rising in the cold as names were read aloud, the cadence both mechanical and strangely reassuring. There was comfort in the routine, though none would have admitted it aloud. The barracks smelled of pine planks and coal smoke. Inside, bunks were stacked neatly, blankets folded military tight. At first the women feared every movement might be punished, but soon they discovered that order, not cruelty, defined their days. Guards checked windows and stoves, then left them to their own devices. For women accustomed to a world of rubble, chaos, and air raid sirens, the predictability felt disorienting. Even boredom was a luxury they had forgotten. Ilse found herself working in the camp infirmary, her skills as a nurse's assistant put to use tending not just German prisoners, but, occasionally, American soldiers with sprained ankles or coughs. The strangeness of bandaging the enemy's wounds was not lost on her. She recalled the propaganda again, Americans as brutes, less than human. Yet here, in the antiseptic glow of the infirmary, their blood was the same red, their coughs the same hollow rattle. She whispered the German word for breathe as she guided a boy's chest upward, and though he could not understand, he obeyed, eyes grateful. That moment stayed with her longer than the meals. Anna, meanwhile, was assigned to the camp kitchen. At first, handling sacks of flour and crates of potatoes felt like mockery, as though the Americans wanted her to confront the abundance she had been denied at home. But soon she realized the kitchen gave her a strange power. She could knead dough again, the same motion she had used beside her mother in a Hamburg bakery before the bombs fell. Bread rose in ovens, filling the air with a warmth that no uniform or fence could erase. For the first time since her husband's death at the front, she felt like herself. Outside the barracks, life unfolded in unexpected ways. The Americans allowed access to a small library. Books in German were scarce, but they came: Goethe, Schiller, even American novels translated into stiff, formal German. The women gathered at night under the weak glow of bulbs to read aloud, voices weaving a fragile thread back to culture, to memory, to something beyond survival. Sometimes laughter escaped them, uneasy, guilty laughter, when a character's troubles in a novel seemed less daunting than their own had been in Germany. Sports became another surprise. The Americans loved baseball, a game that to German eyes looked like a strange ritual of sticks and running in circles. Guards occasionally tried to teach the rules, tossing balls across the yard. The women played awkwardly, skirts flaring, laughter spilling when someone swung and missed so wildly that even the guards chuckled. To play, even badly, felt like defiance against despair. Yet some refused, muttering that games with the enemy were shameful. Captivity divided them, not only from their country but from each other. Still, contrasts were sharp. News trickled in from home, letters delayed by months, rumors of starvation, bombings, collapse. One woman read that her mother had died during a raid. Another heard her child had been evacuated and lost somewhere in Bavaria. Their grief seeped into nights when the laughter faded, and the feast in the dining hall tasted suddenly bitter. How could they eat well while families at home wasted away? Guilt clung heavier than chains. And yet, the camp did not freeze them in misery. American policy sought not only to house but to occupy. Women learned new skills: sewing uniforms, mending tools, tending gardens where tomatoes grew fat in the soil. Their hands, once calloused from hauling rubble in ruined cities, now coaxed life from earth. Each sprout felt like rebellion against the destruction they had left behind. Some whispered that it was easier to breathe here than it had been in Germany. Others shook their heads, unwilling to admit relief. Statistics reinforced what they lived daily. Nearly 425,000 German POWs were held in America, and though women numbered only a small fraction, their treatment mirrored that of men: 3 meals, work assignments, access to education. It was captivity, yes, but it was not torment. For the Americans, the system was pragmatic, even dull. For the women, it was a mirror held up to their own government's lies. Ilse confided to Anna one night, voice low so the others could not hear, "I am more afraid of my thoughts than of these guards." Anna understood. The true conflict was no longer between prisoner and captor but between belief and reality. Every meal, every courtesy, every small freedom eroded the wall of propaganda brick by brick. What had once been certain now felt fragile. If America was not the monster, then who had been lying all along? The women's lives inside the wire became a strange balancing act. Gratitude for full stomachs, guilt for those starving back home, fear of betraying their own identity, and relief at surviving another day. Each emotion fought the others like rivals in the same cage. At times, the barbed wire seemed less a barrier to keep them in than a frame that forced them to confront themselves. And so the days passed, ordinary and extraordinary at once. Bread baked, books read, games stumbled through, tears shed in silence after lights out. What shocked them most was not the abundance but the normality, the way life could continue even in captivity. Yet beneath that normality, change stirred. They had arrived expecting torment, and instead they found humanity. But the question that gnawed at them, stronger than hunger, was whether they could ever return to the beliefs they once held. One winter evening, as frost turned the campyard white, the women stood watching the American flag ripple above the gate. It was only cloth, only color, but it moved with a freedom their own thoughts no longer possessed. And as they turned back toward the barracks, hearts unsettled, they realized the next revelation awaiting them would not be about food or games, but about themselves. Winter thawed into spring, and with it, the women began to realize their captivity was not only a pause in war but a transformation in themselves. The feast that had greeted them on their first night no longer seemed like a strange performance staged to confuse them. It became a metaphor that grew richer with each passing day. Food was the language of America, and in its abundance lay a message more powerful than any speech. You are not what your leaders told you, and we are not what yours claimed. Every slice of bread, every spoonful of sugar, whispered a truth that had been buried beneath years of slogans and lies. Ilse felt it most keenly in the infirmary. She had once believed that mercy was weakness, that compassion had no place in war. Yet here she was, cleaning wounds, measuring fevers, watching American medics tend to German prisoners with the same care they gave their own. It shook her to the core. She remembered tending to civilians in bombed-out Berlin with little more than rags, told by officers that pity was wasted on the weak. Now, as she pressed a clean bandage to the arm of a boy no older than her brother, she wondered if strength was not measured in cruelty but in restraint. That question haunted her more than the searchlights at night. Anna found her own awakening in the kitchen. She baked bread daily, its golden crust cracking under her knife, the smell filling the barracks until even the most hardened among them softened. Bread was survival, but it was also memory. Her mother's laughter over rising dough, her husband's hands dusted with flour. Each loaf she shaped became both confession and defiance. She felt guilty, yes, her family in Hamburg had none of this. But she also felt liberated, as if kneading dough in an American camp gave her back a piece of her humanity the war had tried to strip away. Sometimes, when she carried warm rolls into the dining hall, she caught guards sneaking a smile, and she realized she was no longer just a prisoner. She was a woman whose skill commanded respect. The camp itself became a paradoxical world, enclosed by wire, yet opening minds. Classes were offered, English phrases, arithmetic, even lectures on democracy that some scoffed at and others secretly cherished. The women debated among themselves. Was this education meant to reprogram them, or was it a rare gift of knowledge in the midst of destruction? Ilse copied words in a notebook: freedom, justice, equality. They felt fragile in her hand, like birds not meant to be caged. Still, guilt gnawed. Letters from home arrived sporadically, their words soaked in despair. Cities reduced to rubble. Families starving. Friends lost. How could they explain that while their people rummaged through ruins for potatoes, they were eating beef stew and reading American novels? One night, Anna broke down, whispering, "I am full while my children are empty." The room fell silent. No one could answer. The abundance that had first felt miraculous now weighed like a stone. Yet even in their guilt, they sensed something irreversible taking root. The enemy had shown them kindness, and with it came the most dangerous transformation of all: doubt. If America could treat them like humans, then what did that make of the Reich's endless warnings? Doubt spread like a quiet rebellion, invisible but unstoppable. It showed itself in small acts: a woman humming an American tune she heard from a guard, another sketching the outline of the camp library in her journal with care rather than contempt. Humor, too, crept in, sly and unbidden. One afternoon, the guards introduced them to peanut butter. The women recoiled, confused by its sticky texture, some laughing that it must be glue. Yet by the next day, they spread it thick on bread, shaking their heads at their own delight. "If this is American propaganda," Ilse quipped softly, "then it works better than bullets." The barracks erupted in laughter, half in jest, half in surrender. The true climax, however, was not in a meal or a joke but in the quiet shift of perspective. One evening, after roll call, the women gathered outside. The sun dipped low, painting the wire fence in fire. They watched as the American flag lifted in the breeze, its colors sharp against the fading sky. For years, they had been told to despise that banner, to see it as a symbol of decay, greed, arrogance. Yet in that moment, it looked different, less like an enemy's emblem, more like a strange promise they could not yet name. Anna spoke first, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps we were never meant to win. Perhaps we were meant to see this." No one replied, but her words settled in the air like embers, burning softly. They all knew she had touched the truth. Captivity had not broken them. It had shown them another way of being. And once seen, it could not be unseen. When the war finally ended, and the women were told they would soon be sent back, the news struck like a blow. Home meant ruins, hunger, shadows of everything they had lost. America, for all its fences, had given them something their homeland had not in years: dignity in small, daily acts. The feast of that first night had been more than nourishment. It had been prophecy. Bread and butter had become weapons sharper than steel, carving new shapes in their minds. As Ilse folded her blanket for the last time, she thought of her first night, the terror, the disbelief, the taste of pie melting on her tongue. She had entered captivity, certain she knew who the enemy was. She left uncertain of everything except this: she had changed. And that change, more than her freedom, frightened her most. For though the gates would soon open, a question lingered like the smell of coffee at dawn. If the enemy could show them humanity, what awaited them in the ruins of their own home? Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.